This is a review of 2023. It's the first week of January 2024. Really, I'd say there's two big things that I took away from this year of reading. Number one would be how I read, right? Certainly when I go back and look at when these things were read, and the amount of books that I read when I read them, right? Is that I didn't do the math exactly, but I think like 80 to 75% of my books that I read this year all came within the first 5 months of the year, right? And then I didn't do a whole bunch of reading afterwards, and that was because of a combination of things, right? The summer was all camp, and so I read a little bit, but because of the way camp is structured, I didn't spend the time to do something that takes some mental energy on my part to read, right? The other part would then be student teaching, right, in which I did not do a lot of personal reading during that time. During breaks, I read, but after I finished student teaching, since Thanksgiving, I'm gonna have read 2 books, 3 books, maybe. And part of that's because of the last book that I read for this year, which was a miserable time. But, right, it also doesn't count the fact that I did teach 2 different books, I should say 3 different pieces of literature, only one of which I had read before in Macbeth, and the other 2 were ones that I was reading, learning, and teaching at the same time, in Beowulf and in Dante's Inferno. And the reason why I didn't post my thoughts on those is because we read adapted versions of those, right? We read a very shortened version of Beowulf, and then we only read snippets of Dante's Inferno, where the major goal there was for students to do just a presentation on a small section, right, rather than a full-on paper on a book, right, on a piece of literature. So that's that, right? So just in terms of how I read, certainly maybe this is the way it's going to be, right? Is that because I am so involved and focused on teaching, right, that maybe I just simply won't read as much, at least for this first couple of years, while I get my feet underneath me and I understand. But certainly, right, I could see myself, as I get used to teaching a repertoire of books, is then once I get comfortable doing that, then going out and branching out and being able to spend that mental expenditure at the same time as teaching, right? So that's that, right? I think it's also that, thinking about the way the reading is done for me is different, right? Is that I got exposed to a lot of things through college because it was you have to read this piece of literature in a week, and then we have to discuss it and write a paper on it, right? And so not only do you have to read it, but you have to understand it or know how to make it look like you've understood it, right? And that's certainly one way to do it as you're trying to learn it, but once you're trying to teach it, it's a different matter altogether, because you have to be able to start trying to field questions and understand talking points out of the blue, right? You are the one that's leading this and trying to get other people interested in it. You know, I would say that I did a decent job at it, right? We're reading books, and we were reading pieces of literature that I think is sometimes so far off from, you know, the people that wrote it that it's hard to describe, or it's hard to really understand what they were going, like how this connects to us. And I did my best to try to, you know, but certainly what made them more interested was pointing out the weird things and pointing out the fun things, rather than my personal journey through reading and whatnot, which is finding the nuances and, you know, looking at the history of things and all that jazz. So that's that. Yeah, no. And then the other thing that for me to talk about would be that, like, certainly I didn't hit the number that I wanted to. I wanted to hit 100 books by the end of the year, which didn't happen. I don't know exactly off the top of my head how many books there have been. But, right, it's good to have that goal in mind, right? Inherently it is, right? It's an important goal, just to say, hey, numerically, right, I want to hit this goal. It might be a little out of reach, but I want to hit this goal, right? Because that forces you to then say, hey, if I'm gonna hit this long-term goal, I'm going to have to sacrifice some of these smaller things, right? You know, certainly things like, you know, the amount of hours that I've just put into Baldur's Gate 3 and over the past week, right? Could I have been reading during that time? Absolutely, I could have. But I made the decision to play Baldur's Gate 3 instead of read, right? And that's not a bad decision or a wrong decision, it's just a decision, right? But keeping those numerical goals in mind is important. However, right, putting those goals too far out does two different things. Number one, I think it discourages once you start getting closer to deadlines of like, oh, I'm not gonna make it, so I'm gonna stop caring, right? That's not a good, right? Also, for this specific instance, right, in setting goals, is that because of, right, the nature of literature, right? I mean, there are people out there that cook through 200, 300 books in a year, which is great for them, right? But when you look at, I don't want to say the quality of literature, right? Because that discourages, right? But looking at the way that we intake literature and think about literature, right? It's that instead of watching 3 movies, we are sitting down and reading a book for fun that does the same, just in gestation of it, rather than thinking about it, right? High numerical goals also kind of discourage reading the really long books, right? Like one of the books I want to read this year is War and Peace, right? I have it, right? Which is just a monster of a book, right? And a lot of these big Russian books, you know, it kind of discourages from like reading those if you're only trying to hit a number, right? So it's kind of give and take. That's that, right? You know, there's nothing wrong with reading literature in lieu of or in place of a movie or music or some other form of entertainment, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? You know, Suddenly a Murder, which I just read and I enjoyed, right, I think falls into that category of where there's a little bit of discussion that can be done with it. And, but I feel in my video, I pulled out everything that I could, right? So, right, it's not, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's just that if you set too high of a number, set too high a goal in general, right, what ends up happening is, well, you start ingesting just to ingest instead of actually thinking about what you're doing. Which I do have to say is one of the criticisms I have about the way that we teach, right? I'm going into education, and so, one of my big things, right, is that the way that I structured what I was teaching, what I had control over, was doing long processes, right? I taught for 12 weeks, and I taught only 3 pieces of literature in those 12 weeks, and those were all relatively short pieces that I had them do, right? Because we did a very shortened version of Beowulf, which I read 6 different sections of Beowulf. I should say we read it in 6 different sections. I think the total chapters in Beowulf turned out to be 12 to 15 off the top of my head. But really that's only 30-ish pages. When we did Dante's Inferno, I broke down the cantos into, okay, here's what's discussed in each canto, here's kind of the sins that are talked about, and they only had to focus on at most 4 cantos at a time. And then when we did Shakespeare's Scottish play, right, we broke that down a lot, and we read that in class, and we acted it out, and we played a game with it effectively, right? And really, I think that the Shakespeare Scottish play definitely did the best, just because I think that there's a way to go about doing it, right? Could you do that with everything? No, you couldn't, but, right, you could with that. Yeah. But, looking at the way that we then taught the 11th graders, right? American literature. Now, when I did my American literature course, it was all short stories, right? That's what it was almost all short stories. And then we started reading some of the longer books later on. I don't know exactly how the school that I was teaching at aligns their stuff, but, right, for them, it was like you're doing 4 different things at once, and you're trying to have to harken back and remember what we talked about a week ago, while you're also looking forward to the week after, right? And I get why it was being done, but I'm not as appreciative of that, right? Because what it fosters is we taught basically in Socratic seminars, and what it fosters is gamifying it, right? Making it into, okay, I'm just going to spout off my things to get my points and memorize what I have to say, and then not caring what anyone else says, right? Or scripting all out, which I did have the class try to do. They tried really hard to script everything out. And, it's, from a social standpoint, it's interesting, right? And it's fun. But from an academic standpoint, right, that's not what I want them to do, right? It's not about just saying things to get your points, right? It is, trying to learn and have a discussion about real world things that are happening around us, right? Not just Here's an example. Here's a quote. All right, here's a question. Now I don't have to worry about talking for another 30 minutes, right? But a lot of that, I think, comes down to the fact that the way that we approached teaching is to just overload them with stuff. So then, this thing, instead of being an interesting discussion and then wanting to talk about things, became, I just have to fuel this fire for points, right? So that's that, right? That's my thoughts on that. But yeah, that's my thoughts on reading and learning in 2023. Kat, you have anything else to add? All right.